Thanks for talking with me today. So I want to start out with the idea of a Hegelian critique of Marx. So
Yeah.
in With the Negative, Slavoj Žižek says the time has come for Hegelian critique of Marx. And he sort of does that, even though he still calls himself a Marxist. And I think you really have taken that to a whole other level because you are thinking about the way in which Marx misses Hegel's logic at the same time he's appropriating it. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I think I'm looking at, in this book that I'm doing that should be out soon, hopefully, I'm looking at how Hegel's notion of the dialectic, basically, right, can assist us in understanding the economy even better than Marx did, despite the fact that, of course, he used, to an extent at least, Hegel's dialectic. So what I'm trying to demonstrate there, to put it in really simple terms, is that Marx went up to a certain point, but never really employed the Hegelian dialectic in its complexity. It's almost as if he missed a few steps of Hegel's dialectic. It almost stops too soon. For example, the obvious example would be the understanding of the proletariat, the labor,
right,
as somewhat independent of the dialectical relationship with capital.
right.
So there's a point in which, of course, labor acquires independence and can almost extract itself from the dialectical relationship. So I think the key term, really, the key Hegelian figure to be rehabilitated in many ways is that positing of the presupposition, which captures the relationship between capital or money in capital form and labor. And in a sense, to oversimplify a little, what I'm saying is that labor is actually a kind of self-externalization of money in its attempt to become capital.
So Marx's faith in the proletariat, you think, is a problem itself?
I think it's a problem. I think also history is showing that it's a problem, but also it's a problem theoretically. And I think that's why also historically it's not working, because it's a problem theoretically, right? In many ways. I think we would have.
Yeah, so the theoretical problem has actually caused the historical.
Yeah, I think so. I think history is showing that there's a theoretical problem with this notion of labor as, to an extent, independent or able to extract itself from the dialectical relationship with capital. My point is that labor was always a kind of filiation, a kind of product of money that attempts to become capital. Right? It's a necessary step for money to become capital.
So yeah, go ahead.
So no, I mean that's the fundamental point that I think needs to be rehabilitated today. The idea that there's a positing of the labor presupposition almost, and that's capital's way, money's way of becoming capital, of course, right? Through the but labor intended as in a capitalist way, of course, is a capitalist category. It's a capitalist invention almost, I would say. Wage labor. I'm talking about wage labor, of course. So labor as in a very specific historical understanding, conditioning even, right? So reduced to labor time, for example. And of course, the whole equivalence between labor time and money, it's just a wonderful capitalist invention. It's not real. It's something that we believe that it's real, but there's no way of justifying the equivalence between labor time and money. It only makes sense in the capitalist setting. You see what I mean? It only becomes sense insofar as some surplus value needs to be extracted from labor. So labor has to be counted in a certain way.
Right. And does that only work if labor is, I've heard you say before when we were talking that labor is substantialized by Marx and by capital itself, I think, right? Like that that labor isn't seen as subject. Like Hegel's part of positing the presuppositions is seeing the way that substance is always subject, right? That it's all that there's nothing substantial that has a kind of substantial weight in itself, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is that the mistake that Marx makes about labor, and is that also the mistake that capital makes about labor?
Yeah, Marx is of course ambiguous about it, right? It oscillates between, I think, the Hegelian understanding of labor and in a sort of dialectical Hegelian labor, and the kind of positivist, sort of quantifiable understanding of labor. I think even historically, Marx is caught within these two dimensions. Obviously, there's the Hegelian culture, which is still very strong in the 19th century, at least the first part. And then there's positivism, which is becoming dominant, of course, at the end of the century. And I think Marx almost gets caught in between these two, this fight between these two ideas, big ideas. And of course, he sacrifices quite a lot of his, I think, Hegelianism for the positivistic understanding of labor, even as something countable, for example, right? As something countable and something fundamental that to one extent can also be seen as non-dialectical, right? Or at least independent of the dialectical relationship to capital.
That's why if you take labor out of capital, it actually, for Marx, becomes even more productive, right? Like that's his vision of communist society, that labor has gotten rid of the chains of capitalist society, and then its productivity is unleashed. And that, you're saying that's a way in which he takes labor as independent capital, right?
Yeah,
sure.
Through socialism, of course, that's the step towards then the communist future, which it's a kind of utopian state, where labor it's then something totally different. But to him, the step towards that utopian condition is certainly through the independence, to an extent, of labor from the capitalist relation, right? And I think that's where the Hegel would disagree with Marx. If Hegel was able to come back to life and see what Marx did, would say, hey, wait a second, my dialectic actually was a bit more complex than that. You cannot simply extract one of the two terms and say this is more important than the other, because the whole point of the dialectic, of course, is that you always posit the presuppositions in an endless circle, and the whole point is that you're trying to hide some fundamental negativity, right? You try to conceal or even make it work in some way, a fundamental dialectical negativity. And I think the key term in that respect is surplus value.
Okay, I want to talk about that because do you see, I think you see a problem in Marx's notion of surplus value. And it's interesting because that's one of the things that I think mainstream economists have the most problem with, at least the ones that I know. They think surplus value is an incredibly problematic way to talk about the way value is created under capitalism, right? And I wonder if this understanding of labor as the posited presupposition of capital, what kind of challenge does that bring to the notion of surplus value?
I mean, surplus value is, first of all, as far as I understand it, is not something that you can reduce to an empirical entity, like you calculate surplus value. It remains something which, I think here psychoanalysis has a great way of understanding the relationship of labor and surplus value. I mean, surplus value is the key thing for Marx in the whole capitalist setting.
Right.
The production of surplus value, which then turns profit.
Right, and it hides profit, basically. I mean, the fact that surplus value is the basis for profit, that if we fail to read profit as surplus value, and thus we miss exploitation. And I think people that want to cling to the notion of surplus value think that it brings something to the theory of exploitation, that if we give it up, we lose any way to explain exploitation, I think.
Right, yeah. But I think surplus value is something that you cannot explain in positivist terms, right? That's why I think Lacan is absolutely brilliant in the way in which, although very briefly in a couple of seminars, 16 and 17, right? And then he doesn't really go back to it any longer, maybe a little bit in Seminar 18, but basically abandons the whole idea, as far as I'm aware anyway. It doesn't really turn it into a proper, but I think there it captures something essential about surplus value the moment he calls it surplus jouissance. Right? So it's not a value. That's the whole point. You know, it's not something that you can calculate in empirical terms.
But Marx thinks it is.
But Marx, yes, to an extent, that's why he calls it surplus value, right? Because it's a value. The moment you understand how it works, you can also rectify the whole situation.
Right.
You know, if you think of it as an empirical entity, then of course you can make it right, at least in theoretical terms.
Right.
But I think Lacan says, you know, here there's a problem with the Marxian understanding of surplus value, because he calls it is a plus de jouir. It's a surplus enjoyment. It's a surplus jouissance. So it's something that exists only as a negative magnitude, not as a positive, calculable magnitude. And I think that's the wonderful, idea that Lacan has about Marx and the whole system, that it functions around this little objet A fundamentally, right? This little thing that the moment one has it, the moment one perceives it as a negativity, something that one doesn't have. And if you think about it, it's exactly how it works in capitalism. The more you have it, the more you perceive the bit that you don't have yet.
Right,
you know?
Which is why the people that have the most money are most bent on accumulating, right?
That's right. They want to have more because they only see the lacking bit, right? And I think that's the wonderful trick that surplus value plays. But it's really a trick. It's almost like a semantic trick. You know, it's like, why would labor produce surplus value, and as something calculable, and then if you rectify that, then you can create a much better society. It's simply a negative, as far as I understand it. It's a negative magnitude, which I think it's missing. It doesn't exist, and precisely because it doesn't exist, it does the job in a way, right? It does the job of wanting more and more and more. So I think Lacan is right about Marx, about Marx when he critiques him, and when he says fundamentally he should have called it something else because it's not something that you can calculate. It's fundamentally something that we don't have.
Right. And so is it still for you though tied to labor or not necessarily?
Yeah, it's tied to the way in which labor functions in relation to money capital. It's tied to the production mechanism, and to the idea that labor, when it's put to work, produces a surplus, right?
Right.
But scientifically, you cannot really prove that there is a connection between this surplus and the labor that has produced it. You know, it's really a matter of you can only understand it semantically as something that is missing, as something that is not there, and by not being there, it makes the whole system work.
But it's still the basis for profit, right?
Yeah, it's still the profit is the kind of empirical dimension,
right? Okay,
of it. But surplus value, you know, I think Lacan is absolutely right. It's a surplus jouissance. It's something which can only exist as in negative form. You know, it can only exist as a kind of.
Could it be tied to derivatives, or does it have to be tied to labor?
Yeah, I think that's why in a way, when you think about financial capitalism, it's fundamentally the same logic. Right. It's not a different logic at all from labor. You know, the way in which labor and capital interact. It's only that you just get rid of the middle term. You just get rid of the pretense. Even, you know, you get rid of labor, and all you get is simply money reproducing itself in a speculative manner. Whereas with labor, of course, the trick is that you have to pay somebody in order to to create this surplus. But I think Lacan's critique is still the best critique that you get of Marx's notion of surplus value, because in a sense it's much closer to Hegel than Marx was, I would say, right? The Lacanian critique of it, because everything functions around a missing link. Everything functions around a negativity, something that you cannot calculate, something that you cannot have. And of course, I think Marx tended to understand the surplus as something calculable. That's why he called it value. It's a value, it's something that one can calculate. But I think in itself, it's just it's a minus sign that makes the whole system work around it. And you never have it. You never actually have it. You can have more and more profit, but surplus value remains this kind of phantasmatic entity, which it's the key, of course, to the whole engine, right? I think it makes the whole engine.
So you can't. So for you, there's no way, as there is for Marx, I know, to translate profit back into surplus value. You just can't do it, because surplus value is never a defined empirical value.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And that's why finance capital can also create it, because it has this ability to generate this negative magnitude in the same way that labor does.
Yeah. As long as you believe in it, you know, that there is this substance, then you're okay. But what I'm saying is that even the labor capital relation, although people tend to think, but it's based on something solid, which is the exploitation of labor.
It still takes faith.
It still takes faith.
Yeah.
It's still an invention. It's still a wonderful creative enterprise. And I think that's why it's so fascinating to see how the feudal society became capitalist society. Whenever it is that one wants to make it start, whether it's the 16th century, 15th century, or earlier, blah blah blah. There's a moment when a very creative moment when all of a sudden the understanding of work changed, and it started to be measured. It started to be measured in labor time, right? And paid, of course, according to that labor time. And that was the trick that created this illusion, fundamentally, that an excess can be extracted from it. And
you have to believe in that possibility.
You have to believe in it, absolutely. And I think that belief is so entrenched, of course, in our world, in our societies. But the moment we enter a post-capitalist society, of course, that belief will have to change. Another belief, another form of fetishism, if you like, will have to emerge. Of course, there is that sort of fetishism in our capitalist society. We believe that there is surplus value. We believe that labor produces value. Why should labor produce values?
Right. I have a kind of materialist, idealist question for you. Like, which is it? Is it our belief system changes and then the economic system changes? Or is it what you just described? The economic system changes and then our beliefs have to follow from that?
That's a really good question, because, I think if you're a Hegelian, you have to think that the presuppositions are getting sorted,
Right.
So you can never really you can never plan the future. Right. You can never try to understand what needs to change. Things change, and then you adapt around that change.
Right.
Obviously, you can push for some kind of change, but then the result will probably be slightly different. And
it'll be surprising.
It'll be surprising. Without even knowing it, you will have adapted to that new situation without even realizing. Right? You will have posited those presuppositions. And I think for a Hegelian, the biggest sin is to say this is what the future will be, right? You cannot say what the future will be. You can only say there are very soft presuppositions that are not based on anything solid, are based on this presupposition that they work, but fundamentally they're based on a negative, on a non-existent basis, that can be changed and can be revolutionized, etc. But to predict the future, it's certainly not Hegelian.
No, I know.
What do you think? Don't you agree?
I think especially because of that term that you used, the positing of the presuppositions, which is, I think, it's interesting the way in which this Freudian idea of Nachträglichkeit or retroactivity really aligns with this Hegelian idea of positing presuppositions. And I think that's maybe the point at which they both come together and are against the future. It's funny that they've both kind of been appropriated by the left because they were, I mean, Hegel was a quasi-leftist, but Freud was certainly a conservative, right? Like they didn't think that their thought had the ability to change the world, right? And so it's interesting that now I think the most energy on the left comes from this Freudian Hegelian conjunction, which is just a very strange thing because it's like what you said, like the greatest sin for a Hegelian is to try to predict the future, and even trying to create a different future, you recognize that you have no idea where you're pushing it toward. It could be worse.
That's right.
It could be worse.
You have to change the presuppositions somehow, right? Like we intervene into the way the past is made sense of. Right. Like for example, labor. Labor is the big question. What will become of labor? What kind of understanding of labor will we have in a post-capitalist society? Something will have to change there, to shift, because capitalism, I think, was born on the assumption that labor creates values,
right?
And then it creates, of course,
if we don't have labor, then we have nothing.
Yeah, but values, of course, for the capitalists, right? To appropriate and to create surpluses and blah blah blah.
Right.
But it's an invention. It's a wonderful creative invention which moved us away from the feudal society, which was imploding, and into the modern capitalist society, which was working according to that dialectic. And in a way, it's a pity that Hegel didn't quite, get to the point of understanding that, because of course he did to an extent. I think he knew what was going on, but he didn't quite.
There were factories. There was an industry in Germany.
That's right. I agree.
So I think even if Marx hadn't moved to England, he wouldn't have had insights that he did into the functioning of capital. So I think it's not even that Hegel was born too late. It's too early. He's born in Germany, so I don't think he has. But I do think you're right that he does see certain things. Like he sees the way in which excess wealth produces poverty, and that's really, to me, that's integral to the logic of capitalism, and he really gets that in Philosophy of Right. So I do think there are points at which he sees things just as well about capital as Marx does.
I think if you look at the Jena period at the start of the century, there he really has a go at the new kind of pseudo-industrial society that was starting. But that's not the real Hegel, because that critical attitude is somewhat based on the expectation that there should be something better than that. Whereas the real Hegel is more the philosophy of right Hegel, when he says, this is where we are. And,
philosophy paints it's gray on gray, right?
That's right. That's right. And tries to understand the situation as it is, rather than, a kind of projecting an idealistic vision of a future that doesn't exist.
Right.
So I
wonder. So in some of the pieces that you've written, you say surplus value, we should understand it as a signifier.
Yeah.
But just now you say it's a negative magnitude. So I wonder, and you align it, of course, with surplus jouissance. So, which is, I think, the objet A for Lacan, right? So is it? Do you think it functions in both ways, or do you think we should really understand it as just the object A and not as a signifier, or how do you?
I mean, it's difficult to say because Lacan's teaching changes a lot, obviously, through the years, and I think that for example, when Lacan talks about a signifier of lack, a signifier of lack in the other, even better,
A
barred, yeah. Right. That, I think, captures nicely the idea of what surplus value does in capitalism. Okay. I think. Yeah. I think that's would be the formula that I would use to say this is surplus value according to Lacan.
So that's interesting.
It captures, because it is a signifier, so it has a function, but in establishing our reality, but it signifies lack.
What's not there?
what's not there precisely, a negative magnitude. And I think that's the secret, and for Marx, of course, he tended to have a more positive life than that, and the whole notion of a socialist society was based on the fact that surplus value to an extent was calculable.
Now, so if you think it's calculable, what do you think it's just a regular signifier? Is that what he thought it, or did he even think it was the phallic signifier? I mean, I think, isn't there a problem? Doesn't he misinterpret what kind of signifier surplus value is?
I think he thinks that it's calculable, and that's the problem, because it's not calculable. It's not a scientifically calculable entity. It's this weird Lacanian objet A type of entity.
Do you think
it's there but not there at the same time? Right. And that, I think, is the wonderful Hegelian dimension of Lacan, right? That he captures that negativity which sustains our positive existence,
right?
And the way in which we organize life around positives. But these positives are always intrinsically correlated with a negative, of course. Right. And I think in capitalism, that negative is surplus value. But for Marx, of course, it was more of a kind of positive a magnitude, right?
Right. So that's interesting. So you would say something like Marx fails to tarry with the negative, right? Like,
yeah.
yeah.
I would say so. I mean, understandably. I mean, we shouldn't sort of understandably, because, well, we could say that he had only engaged partially with Hegel. You can say whatever you want. Of course, he had a very complex relationship to Hegel. He went from criticizing him very harshly to then reappraising him and saying, "Oh, I've discovered something in Hegel that I want to use." But I think it was, to simplify, obviously, I would say that it wasn't Hegelian enough. Like he didn't go all the way in applying the dialectic. Although, of course, this system is still dialectical. Right. Obviously, the way I understand the relationship between labor and capital is very Hegelian fundamentally, but it doesn't go all the way. Because he wants to hold on to something positive.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I think if he wasn't taught by the young Hegelians who themselves had a kind of misunderstanding of Hegel, if he had direct interaction with Hegel, I think it would have been far different, right?
And then you also, I mean, from a historicist perspective, you can think, my God, he was under a lot of pressure, of course, in his own time, which was dominated by positivism more and more. Right. So, there had to be something positive to sell. He had to have something positive to sell also in terms of his own intellectual engagement, right? And so, I mean, that's just kind of a philological question in a way that. But it's interesting how everything is based on that, on grasping the magnitude of that negative magnitude, which I think surplus value fundamentally is in capitalism, and it works precisely as a negative magnitude rather than a positive one.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I wonder if we can think about the relationship between Marx, the capital of Marx's day, and capitalism in our day. And do you think that this understanding has just become apparent more so now because of the way in which capitalism has changed? Or do you think really it hasn't really changed that much? The basic structure is the same. I wonder what you think about that.
I think that there's been a massive change from maybe the 1980s onwards with the third industrial revolution, which is microelectronics, etc. Because that has all of a sudden sped up the elimination of labor.
Right.
So the presupposition for capital, the necessary presupposition in the capitalist wonderful sort of narrative has been inevitably eliminated because, of course, when you have machines that can do the job of humans in a much more efficient way, and you have to compete on the market, then, of course, you tend to eliminate labor. And, of course, capitalism has always done that. But now we've gone to a point where it doesn't replace it. I mean, it cannot, labor cannot come back into the system any longer.
So
There's a point of no return almost, where
right,
you automate labor more and more, and the labor force finds itself not being part of the whole game any longer.
So if Marx would have seen contemporary capitalism, there is no way you think he would have created a labor theory of value, because there are too many areas of the economy where there's profit and even value generated where there's barely any labor at all, right? Like think about the kind of profit that Microsoft Word or even Skype generates. Like
with very little labor involved, right?
Right. Like if you counted it in terms of surplus value, the value creating potential or amount of that labor would be astronomical, right? Its percentage of surplus value created would be just, you couldn't even calculate it. It would be so high because there's so little labor that goes into it.
But of course, the other problem in the dialectic is that labor is also necessary for capital, because you need to pay wages, and decent wages at least, if you want products to be bought on the market. Right. So the moment you shed labor at the levels in which we are shedding labor now, you've got a problem when you make profits, when you're trying to make profits, because nobody has the money. This is in absolute terms. Right. Of course, particular economies can still blah, blah, blah. But in absolute terms, there's a decrease of profit because labor is being further and further eliminated, and therefore nobody has the money to buy back what capitalism produces, and therefore nobody is really contributing to capitalism in terms of profit making, allowing capitalism to make profit. That's why that is such a crucial thing for contemporary capitalism.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That's what I was going to say. Right?
Nowhere.
Like you have to borrow from the future to generate profit for capital today.
Absolutely.
Right. So I guess I wasn't thinking of asking this, but there's this push in the States, and I know I think the last socialist presidential candidate in France had the same idea for a UBI, or a universal basic income. Do you think that gets the job done in terms of solving this contradiction of capital?
I find it fascinating because UBI is, again, it almost takes us, this is my understanding of it, it's almost a Hegelian step away from capitalism, right? Because you're not supposed to have where does the money come from? In a capitalist system, it's not supposed to come that way. You cannot just create it out of nowhere.
Right.
You're supposed to create them through the labor relationship, by paying somebody who will then buy the products that they make, and they will increase. But so you're not supposed to, it might function for a while, and it might be necessary to prevent people from starving, quite literally, to have some kind of universal benefits of the kind. But the basic problem is, where does the money come from? You have to print the money. It doesn't come directly from the capitalist economy. You have to print it. I mean, in a sense, that's what you're seeing today in relation to the virus, the coronavirus, right? You're seeing a lot of that. This massive printing money sort of exercises where all this money comes from nowhere. It doesn't come from
the most amazing one to me is the U.S. Fed just propping up the stock market, right. and it's like unprecedented, amazing. It's like it's like the heart of capitalism, but it's totally dependent on this totally non-capitalist external force.
So that tells you, I think, the extent to which the relationship between capital and labor is not working today, and hasn't been working for a few decades because of labor shedding, automation, what we call automation, that eliminates more and more at higher and higher levels the mass of labor you need to make profits. So when you don't have that, in a sense, the only solution is money printing. You just create money from nowhere, and you stabilize the situation, at least for a little bit to stabilize the situation. But in the long term, this is unsustainable. If you think about it, that would suggest that we are already in we are preparing for an exit to the capitalist society, because this is not the capitalist dialectic anymore. This is not. It's something else. It's creating money out of nowhere because the economy is unable to create that money and that wealth. You know, it's unable to create it, so you have to print it. Of course, there are issues of inflation, etc.,
Right.
related to money printing. But I think, from our perspective, the obvious point is that we are kind of shifting almost away from, and in a way, this is also why we can see this turning kind of towards a more authoritarian capitalism. I don't know if you agree with me, but it's deeply connected with this fundamental powerlessness and inability of capitalism to create its own conditions of possibility. Because it is less and less able to create its own conditions of possibility through labor, through the labor sort of other, then you're forced to become more and more authoritarian.
Right.
So I think, you know, the kind of fascist capitalist scenario is becoming extremely real.
It's becoming maybe the only possibility.
Maybe the only way in which capitalism can sustain itself
Right.
in the future in a kind of non-democratic way, where forms of authoritarianism, but it's already a kind of zombie capitalism in itself. It's not based any longer on that labor narrative, which, yes, it's a narrative, but a narrative that for a while worked, you know, with all its problems, of course, we know that very well, but now that narrative seems to be, you know, moving away, and it's not necessarily there any longer. It's certainly dying, I think.
Right.
I mean, how do you get labor back? It's impossible when you have competition and when you have this incredibly intelligent machines. It's inevitable that labor gets displaced, but at the same time, capitalism is shooting itself in the foot by doing it.
Although, do you see artificial intelligence becoming like labor? Like, isn't this the vision of Blade Runner 2049, where you get these artificially intelligent beings that actually function as a new proletariat? So so capitalism actually starts to work again with this new proletariat. Is that a possibility, do you think?
But you need to pay them. You need to pay them to consume, right? That's the whole point of capital. That's the beauty of the capitalist dialectic, in a sense, and that's why I think it was so successful for so long. Is that there is a sense in which you pay somebody in order to make more money for you, but that person is being paid. So it's, you know, this and can you pay machines to go out and consume? Maybe
I don't know. That would be the problem, right?
Yeah, that would be the problem.
Right. Like if you had if your whole labor force didn't get paid and thus didn't consume, they were just pure labor, then where's the consumption going to come from? Like that's the huge problem.
I think we already have that problem, you know, and that's why we have these money printing machines now, that you just create money out of nowhere because you're unable to create that money through the system, the capitalist system, as you were able to. And that's a major problem for everybody. It explains the massive debt in which most countries are, in which
except Germany.
Yeah.
It really is true. Like they're really the only country in the world that doesn't have it.
Well, the European Union functions for some, you know. For some it functions.
Right, I know. We're touching on a source.
All the others, yeah.
But okay, I want to just finish with this question about: do you see? So I think you've said this, that Marx ontologizes labor, right?
Yeah.
Do you see a future for labor outside of capitalism, or do you think no, labor is just a pure presupposition of capitalism? So our future actually is somewhere outside of labor or beyond labor, rather than some kind of renewal of labor.
Yeah, I think labor obviously in terms of wage labor. So this kind of abstract notion of labor as something that can be retributed through money, blah, blah, blah. That's the capitalist invention, really.
Right.
You know, this sort of free labor, you know. But I think in the future there will have to be labor, but maybe of a different kind. You know, a different kind that doesn't function as it does now, or it's supposed to do now, still within that capitalist dialectic, that connection with capitalism. So, you know, also from a Hegelian dimension, the sort of alienating dimension of labor as an alienating activity
is necessary.
Is necessary.
Right.
So the kind of as a praxis almost, you know.
So you don't see
But
a future without labor for you is a nightmare.
yeah, absolutely. There has to be some kind of activity that allows you to alienate yourself from the abyss that you are, you know, that you don't want to look at, that negative abyss, the blah, blah, blah. And I think labor functions precisely as this sort of self-externalization through the other, whether it's matter or something else, that allows you to stay away from the horror that the subject is, you know, or rather, you know, don't to put it to, but so labor, but a different signification of labor will be possible at some point, I think, right? Because we shouldn't forget that capitalism signifies labor in a specific way. That's the crucial point, that it gives labor a certain, very, very precise definition in terms of labor time, etc., etc. So it's a very scientific, right? And it's like Kant puts it very nicely. For capitalism, labor becomes the key signifier. It's really the key signifier. Before, it never had so much importance. Things were still produced, but with capitalism, it becomes the key signifier. And of course, it does, because it allows then capital to be made. And that logic, I think, today is evaporating.
Right.
The connection between money, capital, and labor is definitely evaporating. It's been evaporating for 40 years, roundabout, and now, you know. But the problem is how to think the next relation, right?
Right. So, but what you're saying though is that we have to invent another mode of labor. Yeah. Otherwise, we risk, if we don't have to do any labor at all, we don't have to work, we fall back in the abyss of our own subjectivity, right? I think that's right.
We need an alienating sort of dimension. Whether we call it paid labor or not, probably not, right? Because paid labor, wage labor, it's really not working any longer for the system, for our societies. It's not working for capitalism either.
But you have to do it. I think the key, though, is if it's going to be alienating, you have to do it, which is, you
have to do something which, whether it's quantified in exactly the same way, whether it's it's equivalent to a certain amount of money, or whether it's equivalent to something else, but there has to be an activity that takes us out of ourselves in a way, right? Through which we externalize our horrible relationship with ourselves. Right. And I think that's the deeply human dimension, that it's deeply Hegelian. Right. And so I think no labor utopias to me are dystopias in many ways, right? I mean, to think of, because there has to be this alienating, I think, activity or praxis that takes us out of ourselves. And whether we call it labor or something else, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that, but the idea that we can simply live and enjoy ourselves without this self-externalization is horror. It's you know.
Isn't it interesting that I think the master-slave dialectic is over talked about and everything, but one of the great parts about it is this double movement of the slave, right? Like the slave's insight comes first from this grasp of its absolute negativity, right? It sees this, it has this absolute dread that the master avoids.
Yeah,
and then labor becomes, in some, I think, like just like you're saying, the self-externalization of that dread is in labor. And I think that's like that movement from between those two positions, I think is like in that one little section, I think Hegel really got at something really basic about the human condition, you know? And I think that's why people focus on that dialectic so much, because that movement itself, from this absolute negativity to then externalization through labor, I think is really critical.
What I find fascinating in Marx is the way he reads that, he knows that, he understands that, but only to a certain extent. And I wonder how much he kind of disavowed his own understanding of Hegel, right? Maybe there's also that going on because of the pressures he was under in his own time, you know, to deliver a certain theory of revolutionary theory where you need a revolutionary subject. You know, there was massive pressure to deliver that. And I think the fact that he never really finished his work, you know, the Capital, that a lot of it was published posthumously, and a lot of his writings were done, suggests to me that he wasn't certain, he wasn't sure about about what he was actually saying, and there was a lot of ambiguity, of course, in the way he was treating, especially this notion of labor.
Yeah. It's interesting. Whereas Hegel finished. Hegel always finished his books, right?
That's right. Yeah. I think there's a degree of complexity in Hegel, which I think Marx is aware of, but is somewhat disavows. Somewhat disavows and doesn't quite go to the end of it, because in a way his time didn't permit it. There was too much pressure to deliver something else.
A positive.
Fundamentally, a positive understanding of labor, but labor. Yeah, I think it's